We're heading into Week 8 fantasy football, and defense is like the Denver Broncos and the Minnesota Vikings. They're still winning us weeks. We're going to get right into it, but make sure to please just go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support, because I'm one of the only fantasy YouTubers who covers defense on a consistent basis weekly. So going down to our first tier right here, the Denver Broncos, they just have to be at number 1 this week for me. They're taking on the Carolina Panthers in Denver this week. Now, here's the thing. I will say that I went back and forth with my number 1 and 2 defense this week. The Detroit Lions being number 2. The reason I did is because the Denver Broncos, they're taking on the Panthers, who obviously have looked atrocious offensively most of the past 3 weeks or so, and they're still sticking with Andy Dalton, so that team still looks like a little bit of a mess. But we obviously know that the Panthers can get hot offensively, but just the way that the Broncos are playing lately, the Broncos are playing out of their mind. They're getting after quarterbacks at a really high level, 4 sacks per game, they're getting turnovers, they're getting defensive touchdowns. They had 2 last week, one of them got called back. The way that they're playing right now, I just can't envision myself benching these guys at home versus the Carolina Panthers. And the Detroit Lions, like I said, they're at number 2 here, and they're taking on the Tennessee Titans. This one was so close to me. It just, like, honestly, I don't know how I can have the Lions defense outside of the top 3. They are playing the Tennessee Titans in Detroit this week. The Tennessee Titans, the funny thing is, even when it was Will Levis out last week and it was Mason Rudolph, they still sucked. Like, they just don't have the talent offensively and especially at quarterback. And the Lions have actually been really aggressive lately as well. Like, they played the Minnesota Vikings pretty tough, and they actually had a decent fantasy outing. So the way the Lions have played with and without Aiden Hutchinson gives me a ton of confidence in this to get after the quarterback, get at least a couple turnovers if Will Levis plays or if Mason Rudolph plays. The Lions defense here, I think, is a smash play 100%. So as far as I'm concerned, Broncos and Lions, they can kind of go switch out. If you want to put the Lions at number 1, that's totally fine. The Pittsburgh Steelers defense at number 3. Taking on the New York Giants at home on Monday night this week. The Steelers defense has been fantastic. I mean, if you just looked at it from a fantasy perspective, obviously in week 7, when they played the Jets at home on Sunday night, it wasn't the best fantasy outing, but they were so aggressive in that game, getting turnovers, getting after Aaron Rodgers. They've got their pass rusher back, Alex Highsmith, alongside TJ Watt. It makes a complete difference here. So with the Steelers defense finally getting a little bit healthier, coming into this game against the Giants, who are playing Daniel Jones, by the way, and that's an important distinction to make, because obviously Daniel Jones has the ability to be a complete disaster right now. So with Daniel Jones, obviously a little bit of a hot and cold player. Sometimes he turns the ball over, sometimes he doesn't. I'm banking on the Steelers defense this week. I just want to tell you guys just really quick. Earlier this summer, I went to see a comedian, my favorite comedian, Nate Bargatze. The seats were horrific. I was up in the nosebleeds, basically. And the only reason I got those seats because they were really, really cheap, but it was also worth going to because he was freaking hilarious. Honestly, I wish I was using SeatGeek back then to get those tickets. With over 28 million downloads, SeatGeek is the number 1 rated ticketing app. And honestly, I love the experience of going to an NFL, college game, and even comedy shows. Like, I'm a big comedy guy myself, and SeatGeek has it all. Honestly, I didn't even realize they have more than 70,000 total events on this app. And just so you know that you're getting a killer deal, SeatGeek puts all tickets across the web in one place for you to see. Each ticket's rated on a scale of 1 to 10, with green and red dots, obviously green being good, red being bad. So if you're itching to go to a big game this year, or just want to see your favorite comedian, you're gonna sleep pretty good tonight knowing that SeatGeek has you on this one. Just use my code FANALYST for $20 off tickets at SeatGeek. Again, that's $20 off your first deal using my code FANALYST. This is a straight up killer deal, guys. Just make sure to click the link in the description below to download the app. So dropping down to our next tier right here, we've got the Bears defense at Washington this week. Now, obviously, there's 2 factors to this one. The Bears defense, number 1, they're fantastic at fantasy football. This is one of the best NFL defenses and fantasy football defenses right here. The Bears defense is taking the ball away like crazy, and they're also getting after the quarterback at a very consistent basis. And here's the other part that makes this one obviously so massive, is that Jaden Daniels was deemed week to week. Now, I say on this channel that if someone is deemed week to week, that's usually not a good sign. We've just not seen good things happen as far as their chance to play the next week if they're deemed week to week. So Jaden Daniels probably going to end up missing this game versus the Bears. And I'm sorry, Marcus Mariota did that against the Carolina Panthers, but that's like comparing apples to watermelons when you're talking about the Panthers defense versus the Chicago Bears defense. They're going to struggle big time in this game if it really is Marcus Mariota. So I've got the Bears here. And the Chargers defense versus the New Orleans Saints. Now, I got to tell you guys, I got a comment, actually a couple comments about this one. Last week when I was asked, why do you continue to rank the Chargers defense so high? They haven't been that great in fantasy football. And listen, I think that's a very fair criticism right here. The number one reason, though, that I've been ranking the Chargers pretty high is that they have good matchups, number one, and they do get turnovers, number two. They're still getting about 2 turnovers per game, 9 fantasy points per game as well. So the Chargers defense is not bad, number one. And number two, this matchup, I just can't envision myself putting them outside of the top 5. Versus the New Orleans Saints this week at home, the Saints still don't have Derek Carr by all accounts. They've obviously lost their big play threat, Rashid Shaheed. So it's like they look horrible offensively. So I just realistically can't put the Chargers outside of the top 5 this week. I think they're a great play. And the Texans defense at number 6 versus the Indianapolis Colts. I think the Texans are going to come in so mad in this game because they barely put up the offense against the Packers just a week ago. And number two, their defense has actually been playing really good ball lately. Their defense has actually been really good in fantasy. They're top 10 in turnover differential, and Anthony Richardson is a turnover machine. They're just not scoring many points either with Anthony Richardson. He just looks pretty bad. So I think in this divisional matchup, Houston's going to come in mad. I think they're going to actually crush the Indianapolis Colts this week. And the Texans defense are a top 6 play in fantasy. Dropping down to our next tier right here, we've got the Vikings defense at number 7 at the Los Angeles Rams this week. Listen, this is not the greatest matchup. It's a short week. The Los Angeles Rams are getting healthier. They're getting Cooper Kupp back. So this is not exactly the greatest matchup. The reality with this one is that the Vikings defense is so freaking good in fantasy football. I cannot envision putting them outside of my top 10 at this point. They are this good in fantasy football. The Vikings defense last week, they got a defensive touchdown to save the week, but the reality is it's not just a coincidence. 3 defensive touchdowns this year for the Minnesota Vikings, 4 sacks per game, over a turnover per game. Their defense is crushing it. They're just destroying everybody. So even in a potentially high-scoring matchup here with a better offense this week against the Rams, I just have to put the Vikings defense here because I know with Brian Flores at coordinator, they're going to find a way to get the job done. The Chiefs defense at number 8 at the Las Vegas Raiders this week, and I think the Chiefs defense here, they're such a good play this week. Listen, the Chiefs defense is actually a much better NFL defense than they are in fantasy football. It's been a little disappointing from a fantasy football perspective. The Chiefs just aren't making splash plays. They're not getting after the quarterback as much. But here's an analogy that I like to use with the Raiders. It's like they're not just leaking oil. The Raiders are literally they're crashed and burned on the side of the road. I mean, their team is a disaster. Aiden O'Connell back on the bench because he's hurt. Gardner Minshew comes in, throws 3 picks last week. So I just think the Chiefs have a great matchup here. The only thing that concerns me with this one, I will say this, the Raiders have an underdog quality to them. They obviously beat the Ravens earlier this year. Do you remember that? That was one of the biggest underdog upsets of the year. Probably will be the biggest. And they beat Chiefs on Christmas Day last year. So the Raiders actually do have a pretty good history against the Chiefs, which makes me caution a little bit. But if they win this game, I don't see how they score more than 20 points. That's why I've got the Chiefs defense here at number 8 still, because I don't think they're going to put up points. Dropping down to our last tier right here. The Jets defense at number 9 at the New England Patriots this week. Listen, the matchup honestly couldn't be much better. The Jets obviously crushed the Patriots just about a month ago at this point. And the Patriots, they're a disaster too. When you have Gerard Mayo calling out his players as soft, you know the Patriots are going really, really far downhill. It's not going to be good this week for the Patriots. I just got to say this, though. The Jets defense have been objectively bad in fantasy football. Ironically, since Robert Saleh left, since he was escorted out of the room by security, this defense has been a disaster. So I just have trouble putting them much higher than this when the Patriots are just as more of a disaster than the Jets, obviously, but the Jets are still a disaster too. Their defense just isn't playing the same ball. They're not getting interceptions. They're not getting turnovers. They're getting after the quarterback, which is what we can expect this week. And I don't think that the Patriots will score much points, but in reality here, the Jets defense, I just don't have tons of confidence in them being the super high ceiling play, even against the Patriots defense. The Baltimore Ravens this week at number 10 at the Cleveland Browns here. I'm sure I'm going to hear about this one. Why are the Baltimore Ravens defense not higher? I'm sure I'm going to hear about it. Listen, the Ravens defense has another fantastic matchup this week. This is a great one. Along with the Jets, their defense is just not good in fantasy. Like the Ravens, even on Monday night against the Buccaneers, they had multiple turnovers in that game, and they still didn't do well in fantasy. And listen, obviously the Browns offense is not nearly as good as the Bucs offense, even without Godwin and Mike Evans. But the reality is the Ravens defense, they're just not looking good. And I will say this, without Deshaun Watson, I don't know what the turnover is going to be like, what the turnover margin will be like versus the Browns at this point. If it's Jameis Winston, it could be high, it could be low. But just the way that this offense is played, and with Deshaun Watson running into so many sacks, I doubt there's going to be as many sacks, so they're really going to have to rely on turnovers and not letting them score much. Now, granted, very low over-under. I think the Ravens are going to be a good play this week, but just not a super high ceiling one. The Green Bay Packers this week at number 11 at the Jacksonville Jaguars. I wanted to put the Packers a lot higher in this game, honestly. The Packers are they're playing so well defensively. Like 17 total takeaways is what they have through 7 games. That's absurd. That's more than 2 turnovers per game is what the Packers are forcing. And the Jags offense are not exactly a super well-run machine. I get it. The Packers defense does scare me a little bit though, because the Jags offense, they are capable of scoring points. So if the Jags offense can kind of match the Packers in points a little bit for a while, like put up 24 or 31 points in the NFL game, that will definitely lower the ceiling of the Packers. But I will say, the Packers defense, definitely a high ceiling play this week. And the San Francisco 49ers at 12 to round us out. Versus the Dallas Cowboys this week, I think the 49ers defense is, I say this every week, they are so hard to invest in fantasy football. This team is so injured. The amount of injuries they're dealing with is absolutely unheard of. It's ridiculous what they're dealing with. But yet, they still continue to put up really good fantasy weeks defensively. Their defense has done really well getting the ball. They're taking the ball away from opponents, and the Dallas Cowboys, definitely not exactly the cleanest brand of football. They make turnovers happen for opposing defenses, so I do think that the 49ers will end up winning this game, and I think their defense will be a major part of it, so I've got to have the 49ers defense still inside the top 12. And as I do at the end of every single defense video, I give you my favorite defense to pick up in advance for next week if you've got the roster space for it. This one's honestly a pretty easy decision to me because number one, the Raiders are terrible. And number two, when you looked at the Cincinnati Bengals at an actual numbers perspective on a deeper level over the past 2 weeks specifically, they've done pretty well in fantasy football defensively. So with this matchup, they're getting after the quarterback more. They're actually getting a couple more turnovers. And the Bengals defense, they're just in a great position against the Las Vegas Raiders, who are a total tire fire at this point. So I think they're a great pickup because they're really widely available. So let me know how your lineup is looking so far this weekend. If you want to see the top 30 wide receiver rankings for this week, click on this video right here.